We call the group by the name it uses itself and use additional descriptions to qualify that, such as so-called Islamic State or Islamic State group.
Well, Jonathan Russell is from the Quilliam Foundation, a think tank set up to counter extremism. Good morning, Mr. Russell. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning.
I understand your chairman recently posted on Twitter that this is a pointless gimmick. Is that the view of Quilliam?
I do feel that this discussion is a little bit of a distraction from the larger point about what this group stands for and the ideology that is behind it, that is also behind many other groups around the world. And so I'd much rather the discussion focus on whether or not we can be confident enough in a liberal democratic nation to identify this ideology as Islamist extremism, i.e. having something to do with Islam but not being wholly Islamic, rather than simply focusing on which particular acronym we use to name it.
But if we did call them something else without the term Islamic in there, don't you think that it would be better for ordinary Muslims, who we've actually spoken to in parts of Kent as well, who feel that they're having their religion dragged through the mud?
Well, I completely understand Raymond Chishti's point that this is to do with messaging. He wants to say that they're not Islamic or a state. But I think it's worth just pointing out that while Daesh does mean in Arabic someone who sows discord, it is itself an acronym for Dawla al-Islamiyya fi Iraq wa Sham, which means the Islamic State of Iraq and Greater Syria. And therefore it's simply a translation of ISIL anyway. So it doesn't get away from the nomination of being Islamic at all. So that's why I think it's a bit of a misnomer, really. ISIL doesn't like any acronym that anyone uses to it, whether it's ISIL or Daesh, because it calls them an organisation, not a state. As Daesh is simply an Arabic acronym for ISIL, as long as we don't call it Dawla, i.e. the state, or al-Khalifa, then I think we're fine.
Is there any proof or evidence, I suppose, really, that depending on what you call a group of terrorists or militants, what difference that makes? Is there any sort of, proof about that?
Well, I do think it is important, and there is significant evidence to show that counter-messaging is important against terrorist organisations, and that's why I can see why we're edging closer to a discussion about counter-messaging. But I think there's a much better way to do this. The government has been talking for a year now about developing counter-narratives, and Quilliam has been pushing for the development of counter-narratives, particularly online, particularly videos to attract young people to the British way of life rather than the Islamic State way of life. And you'll have seen, I hope that your readers your listeners can go and watch the Not Another Brother campaign currently on YouTube that has received over 32,000 views so far, which does exactly push back against this organisation, pushes back against the kind of radicalisation and recruitment that they do online, and gives young British Muslims and the rest of civil society something to think about. That's what I think we need to be doing in terms of counter-messaging, not simply having a convoluted debate about which particular acronym we use to name it.
Ultimately, I guess what you're saying is a name is simply a name. Action and different ways of dealing with it are probably better.
Yes, I think we're beyond the naming debate now. I think there's two things to do. Number one is to identify and deconstruct the ideology that underpins this organisation and others. The second thing is to actively push back against it and understand that we can't simply do this as a government with military force. We can't simply do this as a legislation by locking people up, but rather we've got to do this as a civil society to push back against the messages, the narratives, the ideology, and that requires a much broader coalition of British citizens and global citizens to do this, and it's got to be done online as well. So have a look at Not Another Brother.
Okay, Jonathan, thank you for joining us. Jonathan Russell from the Quilliam Foundation, a think tank set up to counter extremism.